I still remember the sound of her voice that night. Calm and careful, like someone who'd rehearsed every word before saying it. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. The clock above the sink ticked too loudly, and the air between the three of us felt heavy enough to choke on. My father sat at the head of the table, lost in the crossword from the morning paper, while Susan smiled across her wine glass. She'd been my stepmother for almost 5 years, but I never once called her mom. Dinner had been quiet. Too quiet. Until she looked at me and said my name softly. Ethan. I want to talk to you about something. Her tone made me put my fork down. She slipped a small brown envelope from her purse and placed it next to my plate. It looked harmless. Just paper and glue. But my gut tightened anyway. I stared at it. She said she wanted me to take it. That it was for me. That it might help while I was between jobs. My father didn't look up, still pretending to read the paper. I told her I didn't need charity. She smiled, patient and patronizing at the same time, and said it wasn't charity. It was a way to make things easier for everyone. I didn't open it right away. The envelope sat there like a secret breathing on the table. Susan took another sip of wine and said softly that she hoped I could stop bringing up the hospital around my dad. It upset him, she said. And maybe it was better if we all moved on from the past. My stomach turned cold. She was talking about my mother, Rebecca, who had died 6 years ago at St. Paul General Hospital. Susan had been a nurse there back then, before she married my dad. The air went still. My father finally looked up from the crossword, smiling faintly like he hadn't really heard what she said. He asked if anyone wanted dessert. Susan said no. She was full. I couldn't say anything. I felt like I was back in that hospital hallway again, watching a stranger tell me my mother had signed papers to stop her treatment. I was 24 then and too stunned to ask questions. After dinner, my father went into the den to watch the news. Susan started clearing the plates. I stood there staring at that envelope. She looked at me and said I should probably open it later, in private. Then she leaned close and said, "Just keep this between us." Her perfume smelled the same as it had the day of my mother's funeral. I didn't say a word. When I finally walked to my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope in my hands. My old toolbox sat open in the corner. Reminders of a job I didn't have anymore. The layoff from the plant had drained what was left of my savings. $10,000 could fix a lot of problems. Rent, insurance, maybe even get my truck running again. I ran my thumb over the flap, debating whether to open it. I tore it open and froze. Neat stacks of $100 bills, wrapped with a bank band. 10,000. Just like she said. For a second, I felt relief. Then shame. Then something darker. Money like that never came without a price. I walked into the hallway and saw her silhouette by the kitchen window, the glow from the streetlight catching her face. She turned toward me, smiling faintly. "Did you open it?" I nodded. She said, "I just want peace. Ethan, your father can't handle more stress. You keep bringing up the hospital, the paperwork. What good will that do now it's over?" Her voice was calm, but my chest felt tight. I asked her why it mattered so much. She said some things are better left buried. That's when I realized she wasn't asking for peace. She was asking for silence. I went back to my room, shut the door, and sat there in the dark. The money lay on the bedspread like evidence of a crime I hadn't committed yet. My mother's picture sat on the dresser, her smile frozen in the frame. I whispered to it like she could still hear me. "What did you sign? Mom, what did she make you sign?" The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. My father coughed from the den. The TV murmured something about local politics. And outside, the wind hit the siding hard. I picked up the envelope again and shoved it into the bottom drawer of my desk. For hours I lay awake, replaying every moment since my mom's death. The late-night calls from the hospital, the rushed funeral, the way Susan avoided eye contact when I asked about the insurance paperwork. I'd always thought grief made me imagine things. But now, holding that envelope, I felt something shift. This wasn't kindness. This was guilt wrapped in cash. Sometime after midnight, I got up and looked out the window. The yard lights from the neighbor's house flickered over the old oak tree my dad had planted when he married my mom. Its branches looked like hands reaching for something they'd never touch again. I thought about leaving, about packing my things and driving to Melissa's place in Duluth. But if I left, the truth would stay buried. The house creaked. I heard Susan's footsteps in the hallway. She paused outside my door, long enough for me to know she was listening. I didn't move. She finally walked away. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling until the shadows started to fade with dawn. The money was still in the drawer. It felt heavier than anything I'd ever owned. When the first light hit the window, I told myself one thing. I wasn't going to keep quiet. Then the phone rang from the kitchen. It was my sister Melissa. Her voice sleepy. She said she'd had a weird dream about Mom. She said it felt like Mom was trying to tell her something. I didn't tell her about the envelope. Not yet. I just said, maybe it's time we both start listening. Melissa came down 2 days later, pulling into the driveway just after sunrise. She stepped out of her old Subaru with a box of donuts and that look she always had when she knew something was off. We sat at the kitchen table, and for a while, neither of us said anything. The house was quiet, except for the coffee machine sputtering. My father was out running errands, and Susan was at her Pilates class, which meant we had time to talk. I finally told her about the envelope, how Susan slid it across the table, how she said she wanted peace, how she told me to keep it between us. Melissa stared at me like she was waiting for a punchline that never came. Then she whispered, 10,000, Ethan. What the hell? I nodded. She asked if I still had it. I pointed to the drawer. She opened it, saw the cash, and shook her head. This isn't normal. Nobody gives you 10 grand to shut up unless there's something worth shutting up about. I told her I hadn't spent a cent, but I'd been thinking about Mom, about the paperwork that never made sense. Melissa frowned, thinking hard. Remember how Susan handled all the hospital forms after Mom passed? Dad said she was helping the staff, but I never saw her name on the paperwork. Maybe she signed something she shouldn't have. That stuck in my head all morning. When Melissa left for a bit to pick up groceries, I went to the attic and dug through the plastic bins where Dad kept old files. There were boxes labeled taxes, insurance, house docs, and one that said Rebecca. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside were photos, letters, and a folder marked medical. I sat on the floor, dust floating in the light from the small window, and flipped through pages until I found a copy of the death certificate. Something looked wrong. The attending nurse's signature wasn't the same as the one I remembered from before. It was too neat, too careful. I took a picture of it on my phone and compared it with a copy of Mom's insurance release form that had been emailed to me years ago. The signatures matched. The same slant, same loops. But that form had been signed by Susan Ward. By the time Melissa came back, my hands were cold. I showed her the photos. She sat down slowly, reading every line. Then she whispered, "That's illegal." "Right," I told her. It depended on what authority Susan had at the time. If she was still a hospital employee, maybe she had access. Maybe she could authorize transfers. Melissa said, or maybe she forged it. We decided not to tell Dad yet. Without proof, he'd think we were accusing his wife for no reason. He adored her. And every time I tried to bring up Mom, he shut me down with the same sentence. "It's over. Son, let her rest." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly, thinking about the last time I saw Mom awake. She'd been pale but alert, her voice thin but steady. She'd said she was tired but not ready to give up. Then, less than 48 hours later, we got the call saying she'd signed a do not resuscitate order. I'd asked to see the document, but the nurse on duty said it was confidential. I never questioned it again. The next morning, I called the hospital pretending to request my mother's medical records for a family archive. The records clerk, a woman named Linda, said she'd have to check how far back they went. When she came back to the line, her voice changed slightly. She said, "Oh, it looks like the file was requested already, by someone named Susan Ward. Last updated in 2019. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there stunned. Melissa and I met at a small diner off Interstate 94. We spread the copies across the booth between us. I showed her the call log, the photos of the documents. She took a deep breath. "Ethan, this isn't just shady. This could be fraud. Maybe worse." We need help. I thought about calling the police, but without knowing what the hell we were accusing her of, it'd go nowhere. I needed someone who knew how to handle evidence, not just hunches. I told Melissa I'd reach out to Daniel Cross, an old college friend who'd become a lawyer in the city. She agreed, but her voice cracked when she said it. Just be careful. If she's willing to pay you to stay quiet, who knows what else she's willing to do. When I got back home, Susan was in the garden, trimming roses. She looked up and smiled that same sweet smile. "How's your sister?" she asked. Like nothing was wrong. I said she was fine. Then she said, "Good. Family should stay close." She glanced at me for a moment, long enough to make me wonder if she already suspected something. Inside, Dad was watching a baseball game, laughing at some commentator's joke. I stood behind him, wanting to tell him everything, but the words stuck. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm brewing in his own house. Susan walked in, refilled his drink, and kissed the top of his head. I watched them and felt sick. Later that evening, I went to my room and opened the drawer again. The cash was still there, untouched. I laid the bills out on the desk, counted them, and then took a lighter from my toolbox. I didn't light it, just stared at the flame trembling in front of the stack of money. I wanted to burn it, to prove it didn't own me. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed that envelope to mean something when I confronted her. At midnight, I called Daniel. He answered groggy but woke up fast when I told him what was going on. He asked for copies of everything, told me to scan the documents and send them over. I did. He said, "I'll look into the legal side. If she forged those signatures, it's criminal. You need to stay calm and act normal. Let her think you're still quiet." Normal wasn't possible anymore. Every time I saw her, every time she smiled, all I could picture was my mother in that hospital bed, trusting a nurse who had already decided how her story would end. A few days later, I came home early and found Dad gone. Susan was on the phone in the living room, pacing. Her voice was low, sharp, nothing like the soft tones she used around him. I stayed in the hallway, listening. She said, "He's getting suspicious." "No." I told him to stop asking questions. "It's fine. He won't do anything stupid." Then silence. She turned, and our eyes met. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she smiled faintly, like she'd just hung up with a friend. "You're home early." I walked past her without a word, went straight to my room, and shut the door. My pulse was pounding. Whoever she was talking to, I needed to know. I looked out the window and saw her step onto the porch, light a cigarette, and make another call. That was the moment I stopped wondering if I was imagining things. Something was very wrong. And whatever it was, she'd buried it deep. I spent that night at my desk, reading every file, every note I had, until my eyes burned. The envelope sat beside me, its edges frayed from being handled too many times. I made a decision then. I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. The next time I saw her, I'd have something she couldn't ignore. But first, I needed proof strong enough to tear down every lie she'd built. The next morning I met Daniel at a small law office downtown near Nicollet Mall. The place smelled like coffee and printer ink, and his desk was buried under stacks of folders. He looked tired but focused, the way he always did before a case. I handed him the copies of Mom's medical records and the insurance documents. He studied them quietly, tracing his finger along the signatures. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "Ethan, this isn't just suspicious. It's potentially criminal." He explained how a nurse or family member signing on behalf of a patient without legal power of attorney could be considered forgery or fraud. If Susan used her position to gain access to Mom's medical files after her death, it might also violate state privacy laws. He leaned back in his chair and said, "If we can prove motive, this could blow up fast." I asked what motive he meant. He said, "Money. It always comes down to that." I sat there, feeling my pulse in my neck. Daniel told me to find any bank records, transfer receipts, or emails from the months after Mom died. He said we'd need to show that Susan benefited financially. I told him about the life insurance, how the policy was supposed to go to Dad and us, but somehow got rerouted. He nodded. Find the paper trail, he said. That's where the truth lives. On my way home, the sky turned gray. The kind of heavy Minnesota gray that made everything look older and colder. I stopped by the bank where Dad and Mom had their accounts. The same woman who had helped them for years was still there. Mrs. Hill. She recognized me and smiled. Asked how I was doing. I told her I needed a copy of a few old transaction statements for estate purposes. She looked through her computer, then frowned slightly. It looks like someone else already requested those records a few years ago. I asked who. She hesitated, then said softly, "It says Susan Ward." I thanked her and left. Walking fast to my truck, I sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. Every thread of evidence pointed to the same woman who now watered flowers in my backyard and kissed my father goodnight. That evening, I drove to Melissa's apartment and told her everything. She was angry. More than I'd ever seen her. She said we needed to show Dad. Now. I told her not yet. That we needed proof solid enough that Susan couldn't spin it as a misunderstanding. Melissa said, "She's playing with our family's memory." Ethan, what else do you need? I told her Daniel was digging through the legal side. If he confirmed fraud, then we'd have something real. She sighed, grabbed her phone, and said she'd talked to someone she knew at the hospital. 2 days later, Melissa called, her voice shaky. She said she'd spoken with an older nurse named Janet Miller, who had worked the night Mom passed away. Janet remembered a heated argument in Mom's room between a patient and a nurse. The patient had been weak but angry, refusing to sign something. Janet said she recognized Susan's voice. She remembered hearing the words, "You already agreed. Now sign it." Before the door slammed shut, I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. I asked if Janet would talk to Daniel. Melissa said she would, but quietly. She was retired now and didn't want to get dragged into legal trouble. I said that was fine. We just needed her statement. That night, I went home and found Dad in the garage cleaning his fishing gear. He looked up and smiled. Said Susan was making dinner. Chicken casserole. His favorite. He looked so content that I didn't have the heart to say anything. But then I noticed something. On his workbench, next to the tackle box, sat a white folder labeled Life Insurance Policy. I picked it up, pretending to glance through. The most recent document inside showed a beneficiary change dated a week after Mom's funeral. The new beneficiary was listed as Susan Ward. My chest tightened. I asked him why the policy had been changed. He looked confused. Susan said she was helping me manage things. He said, "I don't really remember signing anything. She said it would just make things easier for all of us." I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told him I'd take the folder to scan it for safekeeping. He nodded, not suspecting anything. That night, I sent copies to Daniel and Melissa. Within an hour, Daniel called back. "Ethan, this is your smoking gun. A beneficiary change like this, dated right after the funeral, could only be processed by someone with access or forgery." He said he'd draft an official inquiry to the insurance company in the morning. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's signature, steady and clean. Then Susan's version of it, smooth but cold, like she'd practiced it 100 times. The next morning, I woke up early. Still dark outside. I heard the front door close softly. I looked out the window and saw Susan getting into her car. She wasn't dressed for her usual yoga class. She wore a navy coat and carried a thick envelope. I grabbed my jacket and followed in my truck. Keeping a few cars behind, she drove to a small cafe near downtown, parked, and went inside. Through the window, I saw her meet with a man in a gray suit. They talked for a while. He handed her a small USB drive. She looked nervous, glanced around, then tucked it into her purse. My stomach dropped. When she left, I waited 5 minutes before going in. The man was still there, typing on a laptop. I ordered a coffee and sat a few tables away. He was talking quietly on the phone. The name Susan came up once, followed by insurance and hospital. I didn't hear everything, but it was enough. I texted Daniel, "She's meeting someone. Probably an accomplice. He told me not to do anything stupid. Get his license plate, then leave." I followed the man out, snapped a photo of his plate, then drove home shaking. When I pulled into the driveway, Susan's car was already there. She was in the kitchen arranging flowers like she hadn't just been handing off evidence to a stranger. She looked up when I walked in. "You're up early," she said cheerfully. I said I couldn't sleep. She smiled and said, "Some nights are just like that." Then she turned back to her flowers. I went to my room, shut the door, and pulled out my phone. I stared at the photos I'd taken. I didn't know who that man was yet, but I knew one thing. Susan's secret wasn't just about a forged signature anymore. There was something bigger, something that reached further than our family. That night, Daniel called again. He'd run the plate number through a contact at the courthouse. The car was registered to a man named Harold Grant, a financial consultant who had once worked for Caliber Insurance, the same company that handled Mom's policy. Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "Ethan, we're in deeper than I thought. Don't confront her yet. Let me line up the legal steps." I said I couldn't promise that. When I hung up, I looked out the window. Susan was in the driveway, standing under the porch light, staring at the house. Her face was unreadable. Then she turned and walked inside. I sat on the edge of my bed, the house silent around me. The truth was unraveling fast, and I was running out of time to decide how far I was willing to go to expose it. The following day felt heavier than the rest. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, like the walls were waiting to hear what would happen next. My father was out in the yard trimming the hedges, humming an old country song, while Susan was inside packing a casserole for a neighborhood potluck. Her calmness made me uneasy. I kept wondering if she knew that I knew. I called Daniel from the garage. He told me the insurance inquiry had already triggered a flag in the system. The company wanted to verify Mom's beneficiary change and the financial consultant's involvement. Daniel said he'd meet me that afternoon to go over next steps. Before hanging up, he reminded me again not to confront her yet. He said we had to be careful. People do unpredictable things when they know the walls are closing in. I spent the next hour pretending to help Dad clean up the shed while my mind replayed every conversation I'd ever had with Susan. There was always something off about the way she said my name. Too soft. Too rehearsed. Like she was always one step ahead of me. When she left for the potluck, I walked back inside. Her purse was sitting on the counter. I shouldn't have, but I opened it anyway. Inside were her car keys, lipstick, a phone charger, and a small black USB drive, the same one she had gotten from the man at the cafe. My pulse jumped. I pocketed it, locked my bedroom door, and plugged it into my laptop. The folder inside was labeled Caliber Files. It contained scanned documents, emails, and spreadsheets. Most were about payouts, but one file stopped me cold. It was a scanned internal memo from Caliber Insurance dated 2018, the week my mother died. It showed a request for expedited claim release under exceptional circumstances, approved by Susan Ward as authorized representative. My throat went dry. Then I saw another file, a transfer confirmation showing $250,000 wired to a new account under the name Susan L. Ward. The approval date matched the day after Mom's funeral. I sat back, breathing hard. My hands shook as I scrolled further. There were more transfers over the years, smaller ones, all linked to that same account. She'd been bleeding it slowly, hiding behind paperwork and my father's trust. I copied everything onto a separate drive and hid it under the floorboard near my bed. When I turned around, Susan was standing in the doorway. She had a half smile on her face, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "You've been busy today," she said. I froze. My mind raced. How long had she been standing there? Did she see the laptop? I said I was just cleaning old photos. She tilted her head. "You know, Ethan, you've always had trouble letting go of the past." She stepped closer. I could smell her perfume again, that floral scent that had haunted me since the hospital days. She looked at me like she was trying to decide whether to keep pretending. Then she said softly, "I hope you're not doing something you'll regret." I didn't answer. She smiled again, turned, and walked away. The sound of her heels faded down the hall. I called Daniel immediately and told him what happened. He told me to leave the house and meet him downtown. But I couldn't. My father was still there. And if I left, I knew she'd use it to turn him against me. So I stayed. Dinner that night was painfully quiet. My father talked about fishing plans for the weekend. Susan smiled at him, nodding, occasionally glancing at me with that same controlled calm. I kept my head down, pushing food around my plate, waiting for something to break. After dinner, my father went upstairs early. Susan stayed behind, washing dishes. I stood near the back door, ready to leave, but she said my name again. Ethan. I turned. She wiped her hands on a towel and faced me. I know you've been talking to people. You think you're clever, but you're making a mistake. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. She sighed. I liked you better when you were quiet. Then she picked up her phone, scrolled through something, and said, I think it's time your father knew what kind of son he's raised. Something in me snapped. I grabbed the phone out of her hand and slammed it on the counter. Don't you dare drag him into this. She looked startled for half a second, then smiled again. I already did. Before I could say anything, my father walked in, his voice raised. What's going on here? Susan put a hand to her chest, her voice trembling. He's been going through my things. Robert. He's accusing me of terrible things. I tried to help him, but he's obsessed with blaming me for Rebecca's death. I turned to my father, my words tumbling out fast. She forged Mom's insurance papers. Dad. She took the money. She's been lying to you for years. My father's face twisted with confusion and anger. That's enough. Ethan. He looked at Susan, who was crying now. Tell me this isn't true. She whispered that she didn't even know what I was talking about. I pulled the printed files from my jacket, slapped them on the table. Proof. I said. Look at it. Her name's on everything. My father hesitated, then picked up the papers. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowing. Susan kept crying, whispering that I'd made it all up, that I was unstable. Then she turned to him, tears streaming. Robert. He broke into my computer. He's been stalking me. You have to stop him. My father looked at me, his eyes clouded. Ethan. Maybe you should take some time away from here. I felt like the floor had dropped out beneath me. He believed her. After everything, I said quietly. You really think I'd make this up? He didn't answer. I grabbed the papers back and walked to the door. Susan's voice followed me, soft and sharp. You'll regret this. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. I stood in the driveway, staring at the house I'd grown up in, the windows glowing warm like nothing was wrong inside. My phone buzzed. It was Daniel. He said the insurance company had confirmed irregularities. They were launching an internal review. He told me we were close. I told him it might already be too late. That night, I slept in my truck behind a closed gas station off Highway 10. The envelope of cash was still in the glove compartment. I pulled it out, stared at it for a long time, then shoved it back. Somewhere between exhaustion and anger, I made up my mind. If Susan wanted to play this like a war, then I'd stop playing defense. I was done collecting proof. It was time to make her face it. When the first light touched the windshield, I turned the key and drove home. The war had officially begun. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was already climbing over the trees. The house looked peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you doubt anything bad could happen inside it. I sat there for a moment with my hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing slow, steadying myself. My father's truck was gone. That meant it was just her and me. I stepped inside. The smell of coffee hit first. Susan was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, a robe tied neatly around her waist, her hair brushed and perfect like she hadn't spent the night ruining my family. She didn't even look surprised to see me. She just folded the paper and said, "You're back early." I didn't answer. I walked to the counter, grabbed the envelope of cash from my jacket pocket, and dropped it in front of her. The sound of it hitting the wood made her flinch. I told her I wanted her to take it back. She stared at it for a moment, then at me, and smiled the way people do when they think they're still in control. She said it was a gift. I said it was a bribe. Her eyes didn't change. She picked up her coffee, took a sip, and said calmly, "You really should learn when to stop digging. Ethan, it's embarrassing." I told her about the USB drive, about the bank transfers, About the forged paperwork. Her fingers tightened on the mug just slightly. Enough for me to notice. She stood up, walked to the sink, and poured the rest of her coffee out. Her back was to me when she said, "You've always been too much like your mother. You think truth fixes things. It doesn't. It just breaks people." I said she broke them the moment she stole from her. She turned around then, her face harder now. "I didn't steal anything. I took what I deserved after spending years cleaning up your father's messes. You think he was some saint, he was broke. Your mother didn't even know how bad it was. The insurance money saved him. And me." I stepped closer, my voice low. "You forged her name. You took her money. You lied to everyone who ever trusted you." She smirked. "And what are you going to do?" "Ethan, go to the police. Tell them your stepmother used to be a nurse who made a mistake. Good luck. You think they'll believe a man who hasn't had a real job in 2 years? You think your father will stand by you after everything you've done to him?" That last part hit harder than it should have. She was right about one thing. My father still didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes last night. I said I'd make him believe it. She laughed quietly, like she was humoring a child. Then she picked up the envelope again, opened it, and started pulling the bills out one by one. She said, "You could have taken this and walked away. You could have left all of this alone. But you can't. Can you? You need to be the hero. You need to feel righteous." Her tone softened, almost like pity. "That's why your life keeps falling apart." I told her she didn't get to psychoanalyze me after stealing from a dying woman. She shrugged and said, "Your mother was already gone when I met her. What difference does it make now?" Something in me cracked. I slammed my hand on the table. She jumped, finally losing that calm mask. I leaned in close and said, "The difference is, she trusted you. You stood by her bed and watched her die. And then you used her name to rob her." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she whispered, "You don't understand. You never will." The front door opened. My father's voice called out from the hallway. Susan's face changed instantly. She gathered the money back into the envelope, slipped it into the drawer, and turned toward him. "Robert," she said sweetly. "Ethan just stopped by to apologize." I stared at her, stunned. My father looked between us. His eyes were tired. "Is that true, son?" I couldn't find the words. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "I can't do this anymore. Ethan, this house used to be peaceful. Every time you come around, it turns into a courtroom." I looked at Susan. She stood behind him, her expression soft and innocent, like the villain had never been in the room at all. I said quietly, "Dad, please, just listen. There's more you don't know." He shook his head. "Enough. Whatever this is, I don't want to hear it." He walked past me toward the stairs. Susan followed him halfway, then turned back. Her eyes locked on mine. She mouthed the words, "You lose," when the bedroom door shut upstairs. I stood there for a while, trying to breathe. The smell of coffee and paper filled the room. The morning light came through the blinds in thin white lines. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I took my phone from my pocket and called Daniel. I told him it was time. He said he'd been working with the insurance investigator and that things were moving faster than expected. Caliber was preparing to file a fraud report with the county. He said once the case was open, Susan wouldn't be able to hide. I told him she already knew something was coming. He told me to keep my distance until he gave me the word. I said I couldn't. I wasn't waiting anymore. That night, I went to Melissa's place. I showed her the files, the photos, the copies of the bank statements. She stared at them with wide eyes, shaking her head. "Ethan, this is enough. Let the lawyer handle it. She's dangerous." I said she'd already turned Dad against me. If I didn't expose her myself, she'd twist it again. Melissa grabbed my arm. "Ethan, please. If you push her now, she'll strike back. You know what people like that do when they're cornered." I pulled away. Maybe that's what I want. The drive home felt endless. The roads were empty, the streetlights casting long shadows on the hood of my truck. When I parked in front of the house, every window was dark except the kitchen. The light glowed faintly through the blinds. Inside, Susan was sitting alone at the table. She didn't look up when I walked in. On the counter was the envelope again. "This time sealed," she said quietly. I'll give you one last chance. Take it and leave. I said nothing. She pushed it across the table with 2 fingers. You walk away tonight. And this ends. Your father doesn't have to know. The cops don't have to know. You get your piece. I get mine. I stared at her hand resting on the envelope. I thought about my mother's hands. Frail and shaking in that hospital bed. Signing something she didn't understand. I thought about my father's blind trust. My sister's fear. And the years of silence that had built this perfect little lie. I picked up the envelope. Opened it. And threw the cash into the sink. Then, I turned on the faucet. The bills darkened under the stream of water. Ink running down the drain. Susan gasped. What the hell are you doing? I looked at her and said, ending it. She backed away. Her voice trembling now. You're insane. You'll ruin everything. Maybe. I said, but at least I won't sell my soul for it. For the first time since I'd met her. She didn't have a comeback. She just stood there, staring at the sink as the money turned to pulp. I walked out of the kitchen, past the pictures on the wall, past the ghost of the family we used to be. I didn't know where this would end. But I knew one thing. I wasn't her victim anymore. The house was silent except for the sound of the faucet still running. A slow, steady hiss like a fuse burning towards something big. When I left that night, I drove aimlessly through the city. The sound of the tires mixing with the roar in my head. Every streetlight looked like a question I couldn't answer. I pulled over near the river and sat there, watching the water slide past the concrete banks, wondering how far a person could go before the truth finally caught up. I thought about the money dissolving in the sink, the look on Susan's face when she realized she had lost control. For a brief moment, it felt good. Then the fear crept in. I knew she wouldn't stay quiet. I'd embarrassed her. I'd crossed a line. When my phone rang, I expected it to be Daniel. But it was Melissa. Her voice was shaky. She said Dad had called her in the middle of the night. Furious. Susan had told him I'd vandalized the kitchen and destroyed family property. He'd told her to stay at her place until things cooled off. I laughed. But it didn't feel like a laugh. She was already rewriting the story. I told Melissa not to come by. I didn't want her in the middle of it. She ignored me and said she'd made contact with the old nurse. Janet Miller. The one who had seen the fight at the hospital years ago. Janet had agreed to meet us the next afternoon. Quietly. Away from the house. The next day, we met Janet at a small diner off Highway 12. She was in her 70s now. Her hands shaking slightly as she stirred her coffee. She looked at me and said she remembered my mother. She said Rebecca had been scared the night before she passed. That she'd refused to sign a form to end treatment. Janet had heard raised voices. The nurse on duty had locked the door. I asked if she was sure about who it was. Janet hesitated, then said she recognized the voice. It was Susan Ward. My chest went tight, she said after the argument. The room went quiet for a long time. Then Susan came out looking pale and said it was over. My mother was gone an hour later. Janet said she had always felt guilty but didn't want to cause trouble at the hospital. Melissa was crying quietly beside me. I couldn't move. Janet reached across the table and said, "If you're reopening this, I'll tell the truth. I'm too old to stay quiet anymore." When we left, Daniel called. He'd just heard from the insurance investigator. Caliber had confirmed the fraud and reported it to the state. He said things were about to move quickly. I told him about Janet's statement. He said that changed everything. If Susan forged a medical release under those conditions, it wasn't just fraud anymore. It was criminal negligence. Maybe worse. That night I drove back to my father's house. His truck was parked in the driveway. The lights were off except for the one in the living room. I could see his shadow through the blinds. I knocked. And after a moment, he opened the door. His face looked older, tired. And his voice was flat when he said, "You shouldn't be here." I asked him to listen. Just once. He said Susan told him everything. That I'd been stalking her, trying to ruin their marriage. I told him she was lying. That I had proof she'd forged Mom's paperwork and stolen the insurance money. He shook his head. "She said you made all that up." "Ethan." She said you need help. I took the folder from my jacket and handed it to him. He didn't take it. I said, "Dad, you trusted her with everything. She killed Mom's name. Maybe worse. You need to see this." He looked away. his eyes glassy. Ethan. Stop. She took care of your mother. She was there when no one else was. The words hit like a punch. I said, that's the point. She was there. And Mom didn't want her there. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he took the folder, sat on the couch, and opened it. He flipped through the pages slowly. When he saw the transfer receipts, he frowned. When he reached the hospital memo, his breathing changed. He looked up at me, his eyes red. Where did you get this? I told him everything. The bank. The USB drive. The nurse's statement. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, I need to hear her side. I said, her side already has your money in it. Before he could answer, the front door opened. Susan walked in, holding a grocery bag, humming softly. When she saw me, she froze. Then she smiled, like nothing had happened. I didn't expect to see you here. Ethan. Dad stood up, his voice low. Sit down. Susan. We need to talk. She looked between us, reading the room. Realizing this wasn't the same conversation as before, she set the bag down and crossed her arms. What's this about? I said. Tell him what you did. Tell him about the insurance money. The forged papers. The hospital. She laughed lightly, shaking her head. You really can't let this go. Can you? You've been feeding him lies. Robert. He's lost it. My father held up the papers. Is this your signature? For the first time. She hesitated. Then she said quietly, that's not important. He slammed the folder on the table. Don't you lie to me. Her face went pale. She reached for the papers. But he pulled them back. You forged her name. Didn't you? You used her death to get money. Susan's voice cracked. I did what I had to do. We were broke. Robert. You were drowning in debt. That insurance money saved you. He looked stunned, his hands trembling. Saved me. You let me live a lie for 6 years. I stepped forward. She didn't just lie. Dad. She made sure Mom couldn't fight back. Susan turned on me, eyes sharp. You don't know what you're talking about. She was dying. She begged me to end it. I shouted back. She begged you to stop. Janet heard everything. My father sank into the chair, his head in his hands. Susan started pacing, her voice rising. You don't understand. Robert. I loved you. I did it for us. He looked up slowly, his eyes wet. Get out. She froze. He stood, pointing to the door. Get out of this house. For a second, I thought she'd argue. But instead, she grabbed her purse, glared at me, and said, you'll regret this. Both of you. Then she was gone. The door slammed behind her, the echo rattling through the room. My father sat back down, his shoulders shaking. I didn't know. God help me. I didn't know. I said nothing. The sound of the old clock in the hallway filled the silence. He finally looked up at me. What do we do now? I told him we let the truth do what it's supposed to. Outside, headlights flashed across the window as Susan's car backed out of the driveway. The engine roared, then faded into the distance. I thought it was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. People like her didn't vanish quietly. And now that the mask was gone, I had no idea what she'd do next. The next morning the house felt hollow, like the air had been scraped out of it. My father didn't speak much. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of documents like it was a bomb that hadn't gone off yet. His coffee went cold. Outside, the sky was low and gray, threatening rain. I told him I was meeting Daniel and the investigator that afternoon to give formal statements. He nodded slowly without looking up. Before I left, he said quietly, I don't know if I'll ever forgive her, but I can't hate her either. I said he didn't have to, but he did need to protect himself. He looked at me for the first time since last night and said, I should have listened to you sooner. Then he went back to staring at the papers. When I got to Daniel's office, he was waiting with a man from the insurance company, a middle-aged guy named Collins. He looked exhausted, like he'd seen too many stories like mine. Collins said Caliber's fraud division had enough to move forward. The authorities were being notified. And Susan Ward was officially under investigation for fraud, forgery, and possible coercion in a medical setting. Hearing it out loud didn't make me feel vindicated. It made me sick. Daniel asked if I wanted to press separate charges. But I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted her punished. Another part just wanted this to end. Daniel said, "She'll face consequences either way. But your testimony makes the case stronger." I said I'd do it. That evening, I drove back home. My father was sitting in the living room. The TV off. Just silence. I told him about the investigation. He nodded again, barely reacting. Then he said, "I got a call from her. She wants to talk." I said, "About what?" He looked away. "She says she's sorry. She says she wants to explain." I felt my stomach twist. "Dad, that's what she does. She finds a weak spot and digs in. Don't let her back in." He rubbed his forehead. "I won't. But I need to hear it once. I need to know why." Before I could argue, headlights flashed through the window. A car door slammed outside. Susan. I got up fast and opened the door before my father could. She was standing in the rain, hair soaked, mascara streaked. For a second, she looked almost human again. She said she just wanted to talk. I told her to leave. She said she wasn't there for me. My father stepped forward, his voice rough. "Let her speak." She came inside, dripping water on the carpet. She looked around the room like she was trying to remember the version of it that used to belong to her. Then she turned to him and said softly, "I never meant for it to go that far. I didn't plan any of this. I just wanted to survive." He said, "You could have asked for help." She shook her head. "You were drowning too. Robert. You just didn't see it. I cleaned up your bills. Your credit cards. Your business loans. I fixed it all. The money saved us." He said, "You stole from my wife's grave." She stepped closer, her voice cracking. She was already gone. "You think I killed her." But she begged me to help her stop the pain. I gave her peace. My blood went cold. My father's eyes widened. He said, "What do you mean you gave her peace?" Susan froze. Realizing what she'd said, she looked at me, then back at him. She whispered. "She asked me to stop the treatment. I just made sure it was done." My father's voice was barely audible. "You're saying you made the decision for her?" Susan started crying. "You weren't there. She was suffering. She wanted it over." He took a step back, his face pale. "You had no right." I wanted to grab her, scream at her, but she was already collapsing into tears, whispering that she loved him, that she did it for both of them. My father turned and walked toward the stairs, his voice shaking. "Get out of my house." She grabbed his arm. "Please. Robert. I can fix this." He pulled free and shouted, "Get out before I call the police." She looked at me then, her face twisting into something between grief and rage. "You ruined everything." I said, "No. Susan, you did." She turned and stormed out into the rain. The front door slammed, the sound echoing through the house. My father stood still for a long time, breathing hard. Then he sank onto the stairs, his head in his hands. I sat down across from him. Neither of us spoke for a while. The only sound was the rain hitting the windows. Finally, he said, "I didn't want to believe she could do it. I thought if I loved her enough, it would make her good." I said, "She was never good, Dad. She was careful." He nodded slowly, eyes empty. Then he said something that stuck with me. "You know, your mother once told me, mercy isn't ours to give." I didn't understand it then. Now I do. I wanted to comfort him, but I couldn't find the right words. All I could do was sit there, soaked in the sound of his breathing and the rain outside. The next morning, the police came to take his statement. Detective Harris was calm and polite, but his questions were pointed. He asked when Susan left, if she'd made threats, if we believed she might run. My father said she'd driven off around midnight. The detective nodded and said they'd put out a notice. After they left, I helped Dad pack some of her things into boxes. He said he didn't want them in the house anymore. Every photo, every trace of her smile went into those cardboard boxes. When we were done, he sat on the couch and looked at the empty walls. He said, "It feels lighter already." I went to the window and watched the street. The rain had stopped, But the driveway was still wet. My father's reflection looked small in the glass behind me. I told him we'd get through this. He said, maybe. But there's still one thing I don't understand. Why now? Why all of this after so many years? I didn't have an answer then, but I would soon. That night, as I was locking up, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. It was short. Just 4 words. She's trying to run. I looked at the dark window. The street silent outside. Somewhere out there, Susan was still moving, still scheming. And this time, she had nothing left to lose. The message from Daniel hit like a jolt of electricity. I called him right away. His voice was tense, clipped. He said Susan had emptied 2 accounts and transferred nearly $40,000 to an offshore intermediary. The investigator flagged it within hours. The authorities were alerting airports and border control. He told me to stay put, that the police were handling it. But staying put had never been my strong suit. I drove to my father's house. His truck was still in the driveway. But the lights were off. When I knocked, he opened the door wearing the same clothes from earlier. His face gray and drawn. He'd already heard. The detective had called to confirm she was missing. He looked at me and said, I knew she wouldn't face it. I just didn't think she'd run this fast. I told him I was heading to her old place near Lakefield. She still had a storage unit there. He wanted to come. But I said he should stay. His heart couldn't take another confrontation. He didn't argue. He just said, be careful. The drive out of town was quiet. The road, slick from rain. The storage unit sat on the edge of a tired industrial park. Half the lights flickering. I parked near the gate and waited for the manager to show. He was a heavy-set man with a limp who looked half asleep. When I flashed my ID and told him the police were involved, his expression changed fast. He led me to Unit 47B. The lock was still on. But I noticed fresh tire marks in the mud. Someone had been there recently. I asked him to cut it. The door rolled up with a groan, revealing boxes stacked to the ceiling, a few pieces of furniture, and a metal cabinet pushed against the wall. I opened it and froze. Inside were binders, all neatly labeled with financial records, property transfers, insurance details, even hospital forms. It was a graveyard of lies. One binder caught my eye. It was marked, Sent. Paul 2018. I flipped it open and found copies of the original patient records, including my mother's signature page. But something new was attached, a second page, dated 2 days later, showing a falsified consent form authorizing the termination of treatment. The signature wasn't even close to my mother's. There were also receipts for cash withdrawals in the following weeks, all tied to the same fake authorization. It wasn't just insurance fraud anymore. This was premeditated manipulation. My stomach turned. I closed the binder, took photos of everything, and sent them to Daniel. He texted back seconds later, saying this was enough to secure a warrant and probably arrest her the moment she was found. I told him I wasn't leaving yet. Something still felt wrong. I started looking through the other boxes. Most were filled with personal things, old photos, keepsakes, and letters. Then I found one labeled, Rebecca. My hands went cold. Inside were pictures of my mother from years ago, clippings from local newspapers, even hospital appointment reminders. At the bottom was a small, leather-bound journal. I opened it carefully. It wasn't my mother's. It was Susan's. The first entries were from before she married my father. She wrote about working at the hospital, about how she'd met a patient's husband who visited every day, a kind man who doesn't see how lonely his wife really is. My hands tightened. She'd been obsessed with my father even before my mother died. As I turned the pages, her tone shifted more desperate, more erratic. She wrote about how she couldn't stand seeing them together, how she was tired of being invisible. Then came the words that made my blood run cold. If she goes, everything falls into place. I stopped reading. The air inside the unit felt thinner. I backed away, heart pounding. And that's when I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps on gravel. I turned, and Susan was standing just outside the open door. Her clothes were wet, her eyes red. She looked exhausted but not broken. Her voice was calm when she said, "You shouldn't have come here, Ethan." I said she had to stop running. She shook her head. I'm not running. I came to get what's mine. I told her the police knew everything. She smiled faintly. The police don't know half of it. She stepped closer, glancing at the open cabinet. So you found it. I said, yeah. I found the part where you wrote about killing my mother. Her face changed, a flash of anger breaking through the calm. You think I killed her? She was dying already. I just helped fate do what it was going to do anyway. I said, you mean you helped yourself? She took another step, her voice rising. You have no idea what it's like to love someone who never looks at you, to watch them waste their life while you're the one cleaning up their mess. I said, you stole her life. You stole ours. She laughed bitterly. You think you can fix everything by hating me. But hate doesn't heal. It just eats you. I didn't answer. She was too far gone. I pulled my phone out slowly, hitting the record button. She noticed but didn't stop. She kept talking, her words spilling out faster. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I was supposed to wait for the doctor, but she was crying, begging for it to end. I thought I was helping her. Her voice cracked on the last word. I had what I needed. I told her to stop talking, that it was over. She realized then what I was doing. Her eyes went wide. You're recording me. I backed toward the door. She lunged forward, grabbing at my arm. The phone fell, clattering on the concrete. I shoved her back, hard enough that she stumbled against the boxes. She screamed, you ruined everything, and grabbed for the phone again. But I was faster. I picked it up, ran out, and slammed the door behind me. She was pounding on the inside as I ran to my truck. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out of the lot. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer. I called Daniel, told him what happened. He told me to go straight to the police station, that I had enough to put her away for good. When I got there, I played the recording for the detective. He listened in silence, then nodded grimly. That's a confession, he said. They put out an immediate warrant. It was almost midnight when I drove home. My father was sitting on the porch, wrapped in an old jacket, staring at the dark sky. I told him what happened. He closed his eyes and whispered, it's over then. But I wasn't sure. People like Susan didn't fade quietly. They burned everything around them first. When I went inside, I saw something on the table, an envelope. My name was written on it in her handwriting. It hadn't been there when I left. I looked out the window, but the street was empty. My pulse quickened. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph. My mother in her hospital bed, smiling weakly. And behind her, Susan in nurse's scrubs, looking straight at the camera. On the back, she had written one line in ink that had bled from the rain. Some things never die. I sat down hard, the photo trembling in my hands, and felt the old fear return. She wasn't finished. I stared at that photograph until the ink smudged on my fingertips. The rain outside was light now, soft against the windows, but every drop sounded like a warning. My father came in from the porch, saw the photo, and went pale. He sat down across from me, his voice low. Where did you get that? I told him it was on the table when I came home. He took it from my hands, turning it over slowly, reading the words on the back. Then he looked at me with eyes that had no fight left in them. She's still out there, isn't she? I nodded. The police were already searching. But Susan had always been one step ahead. Running wasn't her instinct. Control was. She wouldn't disappear quietly. Not after losing everything. She'd find a way to make it hurt one last time. The next day felt like a blur. The detectives came by again to collect the envelope and dust for prints. They told us they believed she was still in the state, possibly hiding near Lakefield. The photo, they said, was a message, a reminder that she still had power. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside felt like her shadow moving closer. By morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I drove back to the old hospital where my mother had died. The building had changed. New signs. New paint. But the halls were the same. The air still smelled like disinfectant and old memories. I stood outside room 214, the one I'd avoided for years. The plaque had been replaced, but I could still see the outline where her name used to be taped to the wall. I sat on a bench down the hall, closing my eyes, And for the first time, I let myself remember my mother's voice, soft but firm, telling me not to be afraid. The way she smiled even when it hurt. The way she reached for my father's hand when she couldn't speak anymore. I realized then that everything Susan had done, every lie, every manipulation, had been built around that moment. Around envy of something pure she could never understand. When I walked back outside, Daniel was waiting by my truck. He'd been calling me. The police had found Susan's car abandoned near the river. Inside was her purse, her phone, and another note addressed to my father. They hadn't opened it yet. I followed him back to the station. Detective Harris met us there. He handed the note to my father, who sat down to read it. The handwriting was neat, steady. She wrote that she couldn't live with what she'd done, that she had loved him in her own broken way, and that she hoped one day we'd understand. The last line read, "Tell Ethan he was right. Some debts can't be buried." They found her body that afternoon, downstream near the bridge. The current had carried her into the reeds. It wasn't dramatic. No headlines. Just quiet. The kind of ending people like her eventually give themselves when there's no one left to deceive. My father didn't cry. He just sat on the porch that night, looking at the sky until it turned from gray to blue. When I asked how he felt, he said he wasn't sure if it was relief or guilt. I told him it could be both. He nodded, his eyes glassy in the porch light. Maybe that's the price we pay for surviving. The weeks after felt strange. The investigation closed. The accounts were settled. And the foundation my mother started years ago was transferred back into our family's name. Daniel helped me handle the paperwork. Melissa came home for the first time in months. We cleaned the house together, scrubbed away the ghosts, packed up the last of Susan's things, and gave my father his space to heal. One morning, while sorting through a box from the attic, I found something I hadn't seen in years. It was my mother's old gardening apron, faded and stained but still smelling faintly of lavender. In the front pocket was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. It was a note in her handwriting. It said, "Love grows back. Even after fire. Just give it light." I read it again and again until the words felt etched into my chest. That afternoon, I drove out to the old greenhouse property that had belonged to my mother. The land had been overrun with weeds, but the soil still looked alive. I started clearing it, one shovel at a time. My father joined me a few days later. We didn't talk much, but it didn't matter. Some things don't need words. By the end of the month, we'd rebuilt part of the greenhouse. It wasn't fancy, just wood and glass. But it felt right. We planted lavender first, then roses, then whatever else we could find that reminded us of her. Every evening, we'd sit outside as the sun went down, the air full of the smell of soil and growth. And for the first time in years, the silence between us didn't feel heavy. It felt full. Sometimes I still think about Susan, not with anger anymore, but with the kind of pity you give to a wound that never healed right. She tried to control life by stealing it. And in the end, she only destroyed herself. There's no satisfaction in that. Just closure. Last week, Daniel stopped by. He said Caliber Insurance was naming a new ethics initiative after my mother, part of their restitution for the case. He asked if I wanted to speak at the event. I told him no. My mother didn't need speeches. She just needed her story to mean something. That night, I went back to the greenhouse alone. The air was cool, the stars sharp through the glass roof. I sat on the wooden bench we'd built and thought about how much had changed. I realized forgiveness isn't always about the person who hurt you. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself from what they left behind. When I left, I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of lavender. For once, it didn't smell like loss. It smelled like peace. If this story made you think of someone you've lost, or someone you've finally forgiven, share it. Tell me what you'd have done if you were in my place. And remember, sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one that finally sets you free.